I did my fourth quarter Cold War project over NATO. To overview the presentation, I'm going to start with my introduction, where I will explain the purpose of what NATO does. And then I will go into the history of why it was created and NATO's participants, all of the countries that are involved in it. Then I will move on to collective defense, which is NATO's biggest point. It is its most important aspect of the alliance itself. And in collective defense, I will be explaining how NATO works with its allies and how NATO has partnered with other organizations to do a better job. Then I will be looking at NATO's command structure, and the two bulleted points on here, A and B, will be explained as well, and how there are different subgroups within these two bullet points. Bullets 4 and 5 are examples of some of the most recent and most important missions that NATO has done or started that are memorable to the United States. And like any missions, those will have successes and failures, and I will explain some of the successes and failures in each example. And then I will conclude with why I think NATO is a success. NATO is an organization with members from Europe and North America, and right now, as of 2020, there are 30 members. And NATO exists to protect the people and the territories of those members. And they're protecting them from terrorism and crises and other issues that may arise while they're either working with their partners or trying to solve some sort of problem. And some of these problems are solved by working with their partners again, and especially using their organized command structure, managing cyber and hybrid defense, and many, many more. When and why was NATO created? Well, NATO was created on April 4th, 1949. It was an alliance that was a reaction to the events that happened at the end of World War II and at the beginning of the Cold War. And originally, it was meant to unify and strengthen the Western Allies' military response because they wanted to keep communism out of certain parts of Europe and North America, and they wanted to keep out the communist Soviet Union. And as of 2020, there are 30 participants, and you can see the list at the bottom here, and then there is a graphic at the top right with all of the countries that are highlighted in blue. Those are all of the participants. The collective defense aspect of NATO is the most important part of the alliance itself. The allies of NATO, all 30 countries are allied together, and what it means is that since they're all allied together and they all have an alliance with each other, if one of these countries is attacked, if one of the member countries is attacked, it's seen as an attack on all of the member countries. And all of the member countries have a responsibility to then step in and fight back and back up the attacked country as if it were their own country. And collective defense also joins with working with certain partner organizations. And what NATO does is they've partnered with organizations like the UN, the EU, the AU, and the OSCE. And each of those organizations specifically works in one category for solving issues. So when NATO has an issue that they need for the European Union military issues, they partner with the EU. So NATO partners with these organizations to help with certain military issues that arise with different territories. Command structure is important because it is generally the backbone of NATO, and the command structure oversees the biggest challenges that are faced in this time period. So for today, it'll be terrorism, cyber and hybrid threats, and a more assertive Russia that is trying to take more command. So the two biggest groups that the command structure of NATO is split up into is the ACO, which is the Allied Command Operation, and the ACT, which is the Allied Command Transformation. And within those two groups, there are other subgroups. Like in the ACO, there are two subgroups within that, and then two subgroups beneath that as well. However, the ACO is primarily responsible for the planning and the seeing out of the NATO military operations. And it generally deals with all of the air, land, and sea military operations. And the Allied Command Transformation, the ACT, it deals, instead of dealing with the planning and the execution, it deals with any change that comes to the NATO military side. It mainly deals with keeping up the link that is between Europe and North America and making sure that they can handle any changes that come to them so that the link won't be severed in any way. My first example, NATO and Afghanistan. The September 11th attacks caused NATO to invoke Article 5, which is the clause that says that any member that is attacked that is a part of NATO it'll be seen as an attack on all of the members of NATO. So any attack on any member is an attack on all members. And so when the September 11 attacks happened, NATO stepped in to Afghanistan and they took command of the ISAF. And before NATO took command, the ISAF's mission was to try and gain more security in Afghanistan. And so when NATO stepped in, they backed ISAF and they tried to, again, gain more security in Afghanistan. The final goal when NATO stepped into Afghanistan, their final goal was to make Afghanistan a safer and more secure place so that it wouldn't have to be the hub for terrorists. And there have definitely been successes and failures in this mission, like there are in any other mission. But some of the successes is that there has been a tremendous amount of growth in human rights, women's rights, freedom of expression, and education. And the women's rights and education have grown significantly more than the others. All of them have grown a great amount, but the women's rights and education have skyrocketed since NATO has stepped in. So that is a huge success. NATO in Afghanistan was kind of a humanitarian mission more than a military mission. It was definitely both, but it was more on the humanitarian side. And one of the biggest failures that happened with NATO in Afghanistan is that even with NATO stepping in, Afghanistan still remains relatively ungoverned. It is pretty lawless still. And part of this is because even though the alliance between all of the member countries is supposed to be equal, it really isn't. There is a disproportionate amount of commitment that the countries have that are a part of NATO. So when Article 5 is invoked, there generally is a chain of who is putting the most soldiers, the most money, the most effort, and the most time into a certain mission. And generally that list goes the United States being first, then the British, and then Germany. And all of the other countries follow. But the United States generally puts in the most effort into these missions. And sometimes it can make some of the failures in those specific operations. My second example is NATO in Libya. So when Libya was going through their civil war, everything was chaotic. And in 1973, there was a ceasefire called. And when that ceasefire was called, NATO stepped in and enforced their no-fly zone, which was the start of their Operation Harmattan. And Operation Harmattan was originally planned to protect their civilians, to protect the Libyan civilians. And again, like in any other mission, like in Afghanistan, there are successes and failures. And one might argue that Libya is a success, and one might argue that Libya is a failure in its entirety. But some of the successes is that the country deposed the government of Muammar Gaddafi, and when they did that, they stopped some of the chaos that was going on in the country, and that was definitely a success. However, one of the biggest failures is that after NATO stepped in, the death toll rose significantly. Not a specific group of people, just everyone. Even a few civilians died. The soldier death rate went up, the protest death rate went up. The death rate as a whole rose. And there was an unintended partial democracy created in Libya. And there hasn't really been a return to governance yet, which is definitely a failure. In conclusion, I think NATO has been and still is a success, because originally it was designed to keep communism away from member countries in Europe and North America, which it succeeded at. And since then, they have been trying to solve other world problems and keep peace. And so NATO really helps with issues like worldwide terrorism, cyber and hybrid security, and other general crises. But regardless of the outcomes, the strength and success of NATO comes from the collective view that they all have, that they're all backing one another, and that multiple countries can come together to execute one solution. And this is supported by Winston Churchill's quote, "There is only one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that's fighting without them." And that comes from the idea that a lot of people think that the worst thing can be working with people. They think that if you want something done right, you need to do it yourself. But Winston Churchill says that there's one thing worse than that, and that's fighting without anybody. And that is why I think NATO is a success, because you're working with people to keep peace.